with journalist Karyn Maughan.
Join us.
Let's walk the talk.
This is 702.
So the NPA is under fresh scrutiny following yet another bungling of yet another high-profile case. This week we saw the Bloemfontein High Court finding ex-Free State Premier Ace Magashule's former assistant Moradi Cholota's extradition from the US to be unlawful. Cholota was accused alongside Magashule in the asbestos corruption case. Ace Magashule and co-accused are charged with corruption relating to the 255 million rand asbestos roofing removal tender in the Free State. This stems obviously from his time as Premier of the Free State. The NPA's handling of this high-profile case has been a significant point of concern, particularly regarding corruption cases. The trial, of course, has been postponed till 2026. I want you to even listen to Ace Magashule himself yesterday complaining about the handling of this matter and the prosecutors in it.
I don't know, my Lord, whether I can speak to my lawyer. The state has always been saying they are ready. It looks like we don't have rights. Because now and then, even if you meet next year, it's going to be another postponement. They said they are ready. Out in the public is us wasting time. Yes. And it's costly for us.
Mr. Magashule, unfortunately, we have to put the road forward. And it's not only the prosecution that may have some problems, but also Defense Counsel have problems in the near future, and then more importantly this court has problems because other cases has been allocated to it. There's absolutely nothing to do about it, but I take note of what you are saying.
That sound is courtesy of Newsroom Africa. That interaction there is between the judge, I think Judge Lobsha, and Ace Magashule, who, again, very weird, stood up to speak for himself, but complaining that this matter has taken too long. I mean, politically, he has suffered whatever it is based on the cloud hanging from this particular matter. And I think what happened with Moradi Cholota might have maybe emboldened people like Ace who are involved in this asbestos matter to feel that they've got cause, right? I'm joined on the line by legal journalist, News 24's legal journalist, Karyn Maughan. Karyn, good morning. Welcome to Radio 702. Thank you for your time. The scrutiny now doesn't become about the accused, Karyn. We're now looking at the prosecuting authority and whether or not it's doing its job well. I mean, it is unprecedented to see somebody like Ace Magashule standing up and pointing a finger at the prosecutors and how they're delaying this matter. They're keeping them there. And again, casting aspersions to the NPA.
I mean, I think that it's understandable for accused people to want their day in court to be, finalized relatively quickly. But of course, with Mr. Magashule and Edwin Soni, they had been substantively involved in the delay of the matter because they obviously brought those various applications, alleging essentially that the case against them was built on the back of the state capture inquiry evidence, and this was unlawful in Sodi's case. And then, of course, Magashule bringing an application which was really centered on the state's alleged mistreatment of his PA, Moradi Cholota, and really replicating her claims, which was the predominance of her special plea in court, that she, the NPA hadn't been honest, that she had essentially been in prison because she wouldn't turn on Magashule. But ultimately, I think, the more important question here is about how the leadership's of the NPA's handling of the Schultz matter, that extradition case in the SCA, and the very strange way that they dealt with that particular precedent-setting judgment on extradition, has effectively stymied the prosecution of Cholota in this case, which is something quite detached from what the prosecutors have been doing, and has everything to do with the NPA's stance on that litigation and the potentially devastating impact it has now had on this case, but will have on other cases.
Exactly. Let's make it broader. Let's move beyond this particular matter. One has to think about the Nulani matter. One thinks about Matela Koko. One even thinks about Timothy Motosho. There is a question about the handling of the NPA of these big matters. Your general sense when you look at the big matters that have simply been bungled or just slipped through their hands?
I think there's a few issues. I mean, you and I are in the courtrooms a lot, and we know that there has been this pathology of arrest first, investigate later, which is problematic. And that manifested itself very much in that Machela Koko case, where it emerges in another postponement application that the court kicks out, that the NPA had been struggling to get a data analyst to go through the data that they'd seized during search and seizures, and that there'd been this sort of, paralysis over this issue, which didn't seem to have been substantively addressed by the leadership of the NPA in that particular case. New Lane, of course, coming before the Supreme Court of Appeal, the judge in that particular matter making it clear that she regarded the state's conduct of the case as a quote-unquote comedy of errors. It is very likely that her decision in that matter with regards to the so-called 204 witness and her treatment of that 204 witness's evidence will be found to be problematic by the SCA, and it will be, in my opinion, very likely to be referred for a retrial. But there were all these warning signs in that case that things were not being done properly. And I think what disturbs me, Tshidi, in terms of the Schultz case, which was obviously what Loubser raised in his judgment, where he basically said that Charlotta was now free to go because of the precedent set by that judgment. He raised the point that, look, that Schultz judgment came out about, he said 2 months, I think it might have been a matter of weeks, before the order for Charlotta's extradition was granted. And the NPA did nothing to engage with the Justice Minister about potentially providing some form of documentation to put that extradition under the seal of the Justice Minister, which was what was pivotal to that case. Essentially, Schultz says the NPA cannot apply for extraditions. This has to be something that's done by the Justice Minister. But nothing happens. And even in the wake of the Schultz judgment, it takes the NPA 4 months to try and appeal. And when it appeals, it says, look, this case can affect 89 different extraditions. Obviously, we know now it's affected Charlotta's extradition, but there are many others. They said serious corruption, serious crimes that the NPA is seeking to bring people back from around the world to face justice. It takes them 4 months to lodge that appeal. They say because of the, toing and froing about who the Justice Minister would be post the GNU. But then they subsequently withdraw the appeal, and we now know Shamila Batoy files an affidavit saying that no, it was because she believed that the NPA could negotiate and with the Justice Department about these extraditions. And there seem to be and I just find this staggering, and I really hope the NPA can explain this. There seemed to be no awareness that the impact of that Schultz judgment was intrinsically going to, as Cholke put it, have this huge impact on 89 other cases. The attitude taken by the state and saying, well, we believe that we could negotiate it in the High Court, whether this judgment was retrospective on these extraditions or not, seems to be fundamentally founded on a very ill-conceived awareness of the law as it stands. And as Loubser points out in his judgment, he says, I don't have a choice here. If the SCA is given a judgment on extradition that has direct pertinence to this particular matter, and it does, I don't have a decision in terms of whether or not I apply it. I have to. And the fact that the NPA seem to not be aware of that is really quite disturbing to me, and I think would be disturbing to a number of people with even basic understanding of the law.
What does that say? I mean, it's actually quite frightening, where there is no understanding or regard for the law from the National Prosecuting Authority of the country. I'm also worried about the issues around like due diligence and due process. We speak about this matter now. I want you to think back to Timothy Omotosho, for instance, where they did make an announcement that they will appeal, but they only start moving the wheels when the issue of deportation is at play, and where it is quite clear to all of us that this person is going to leave the country before this matter is settled. And that's exactly what happened. And what you're left with are victims who haven't seen justice because the authority that they relied upon to find in pursuit of justice hasn't moved either fast enough or done what it needs to do correctly in order to make sure that justice is seen to be done?
Well, I mean, it's worse than that, right? Because there were clear issues raised with the prosecution about the particular prosecutor that was pursuing that case at the time, about his conduct and his apparent and alleged dishonesty. So the judge literally says, I have severe misgivings, and the NPA does nothing. Eventually, the judge is forced to remove that prosecutor. And the judge says in her comments on the argument that she is shocked and amazed that the NPA doesn't do any effective cross-examination of Timothy Madia, doesn't put to him, just puts the basic version of the accusers to him, but then doesn't test him to enable the court to make a decision on the truthfulness of his testimony. It's really like, to use the metaphor, when you've forgotten about your Standard 5 homework and you decide that you're going to try and mash something together at the absolute last minute. But as you rightly point out, these are people's lives. These women went through hell. They were targeted on social media. They were, their lives were destroyed by this. They went out and gave evidence against someone who they accused of fundamentally betraying the relationship of trust they had with him. They go through that for, I think the trial was about 7-8 years, only to find out that they've been let down by the NPA. And, it wasn't, Tshidi, if you were following that case, and I think many South Africans were because it was such a huge issue, these issues were being raised throughout the trial. There were officials in the NPA who were raising red flags about the conduct of the prosecution in that case and the specific prosecutor, and nothing was done. So it's not like, oh my God, the house is on fire and someone just lit a match now. No, you literally saw the petrol being thrown, everything going on. You're halfway across the parking lot, and now you're turning around and going, while the whole place is a blazing inferno, oh, maybe we should have, try and throw some water on that. It's too late. It's just too late.
What do we blame for these things and the handling of these issues? Why is it feels that the pressure, the performing under the pressure and the spotlight is difficult? Is it a skills deficit? What is at the core? What's at the heart of it?
I think it's a complicated thing. I mean, we know the Zondo inquiry at one stage was looking into the capture of the NPA, which, I mean, you and I were both, in those press conferences where Karyn Maughan was getting prosecuted, Anwar Dramat, Glynis Breitenbach. There was a whole-scale capture of the NPA where it effectively became a mechanism that was utilized to settle political scores with people's various political enemies, many of whom were on the wrong side of the former president, Jacob Zuma. But, it happened long before that. It happened when Bulelani Ngcuka decided that, while he had a so-called prima facie case against Jacob Zuma, he was not going to pursue it against Shabir Sheikh. We know that there's a pivotal inquiry going on now into Vusi Pikoli's testimony that there was active interference from the Mbeki administration into the prosecution of truth and reconciliation related cases. Of course, Mbeki fundamentally denies this, as does Justice Minister Bridget Mabandla. But there was clear evidence that there was always this political dimension of interference in the NPA. And, unfortunately, Zondo said he didn't necessarily have the mechanisms to address it, but it was never actually effectively addressed by the NPA itself. And we know there seems to have been a slowness, particularly in relationship to, Batoy's efforts to seek an inquiry and the suspension of DPP Andrew Chalke, who has, obviously a pivotal part to play in the NPA. There doesn't seem to be a huge amount of political support for the NPA in terms of doing these inquiries into errant prosecutors. And, I think that there's a morale problem. I think there's a resource problem. I think there's clear and overt difficulties in getting proper forensic investigation, for instance, in the Eskom case, etc. But ultimately, it has to be about leadership. And it has to be about people stepping up to the plate and saying, we have these problems, let's address them, let's play open cards with the public, let's play open cards with civil society and organizations, and let's find a way, though we are, we've been so crippled by what happened to us, to actually build ourselves into an authoritative organization. And instead of doing these, arrest first, ask questions later type prosecutions, let's take cases to court where the investigations are finalized and we can bring a case and we can get convictions. Because, babes, it's been a long time since we've seen a really high-profile conviction.
We've been waiting. We want to see the crooks who are at the very top in orange, and we are not getting that. The rise of Shamila Batoy was actually a promise that that's what we're going to get. If you listen now to people speak about African Shamila Batoy, you hear that she has been a failure by all accounts and that she's got to go. Her term of office is around the corner, but the patience with her is completely run out. And you did speak a little bit about leadership, and I kept saying to myself, geez, we've gone through so many people, even the Ngasanas, the Sean, we've been impatient with so many people. What needs to be done?
I mean, I think it's such a complex issue, but ultimately it's got to be about, the president also has a role to play here, and the Justice Department has a role to play. And we know there's been this kind of skirmish between the NPA and the Justice Department over the state capture inquiry evidence. There was obviously, when we had the former minister Simelane in there, there were allegations of potential malfeasance there. That was obviously a difficulty. But, I think that it was, you remind me so much. I think Shamila Batoy came in 2019, if I'm correct. And she literally gave that press conference where she said the days of impunity are over. And she spoke very specifically, Tshidi, about the cancer of impunity and she was right, how it erodes at the body politic, how it erodes as our society. Because when people know that they can get away with things, they do. And it really is a huge disservice to I believe, the vast majority of South Africans who want this country to work, who want clean and effective governance, and who want, a proper future. And so it's about, yes, far-reaching political pressure. It's about Parliament. Parliament has been increasingly trying to do a better job in terms of exercising oversight over the NPA. And I think that we are looking at the very real possibility that a civil society organization or an individual has been affected by this kind of, misconduct or problematic professional conduct of the NPA is going to bring some kind of form of litigation to seek declaratory orders in terms of the NPA. We know, for instance, Glynis Breitenbach and Paul Hoffman have spoken about the creation of a completely new body to deal with corruption outside of the bodies that exist with the NPA. But ultimately, it's about that political pressure, and it's about ensuring proper leadership of the NPA. You are right. Shamila Batoy's term comes to an end in January. But Tshidi, we don't have any sense of who her replacement will be or what that process will involve. And again, that's a political question that isn't being answered by our president, because that is within his discretion to answer.
That should have actually been, it should have started, the ball game around that should have long started. Remember, he had a hearing in the interest of transparency when Shamila was to be appointed. We should actually be somewhere in that process if it's going to play itself out publicly that way as well. Karyn, as I wrap up, just very quickly, we're going to end where we started with that Magashule matter. Is it crumbling in your eyes? Is this the beginning of the end? Muradi Cholota is such a key part from what we understand of that matter, that asbestos matter against the former premier.
Well, she is an important person because she was obviously the linchpin between, the alleged gratifications that were obtained from murdered businessman Igor Pambani, of course, we know was one of the major beneficiaries of the asbestos tender, and Magashule. And she says that because she refused to say that, she sent those emails to Pambani seeking certain things from him after payments for the tender were made, that she refused to say that those instructions came from Magashule, that she was then prosecuted. But, there is a very detailed FTI forensic investigation that was done into all the role players in this matter that is my understanding, very strong, and ultimately persuaded the Americans to extradite Cholota back to South Africa. But, I think that, Jan Denise and the prosecutor said that they are prepared to stay this case until the question around her presence in that trial is ultimately decided by the Constitutional Court. But I have severe misgivings, and I stand to be corrected, whether the court, in the circumstances in which this appeal has been mounted, is going to hear that appeal. And if it doesn't, what are the state's options? Because I'm not sure that given the way that they handled the Schultz case, they have much room to maneuver in terms of appealing it. And in that case, Tshidi, it's not just about Charlotte. It's about 89 other extraditions where people are not going to be brought back to face justice in South Africa because of the way the NPA handled this matter.
I'm going to leave it on that note. Thank you so much for your time. That's Karyn Maughan, News 24's legal journalist, trying to help us make sense of the NPA and these matters that it's seemingly bungling and the consequences thereof going forward. It is